Talking today to Paul Lashmar, who was the producer for a BBC Timewatch programme called Spies in the Sky. Paul, when did the Americans start flying over the Soviet Union during the Cold War to spy?
Well, the Americans didn't really start about 1956. They'd really wanted to go much earlier, but there were a lot of political pressures on them not to do so.
And what were the different intelligence targets in the Soviet Union?
Well, when the Iron Curtain came down, if you like, there were a lot of things going on in Russia, and it was a very, very difficult place to get any kind of intelligence from. If you can imagine this huge area, border control was so rigid that you couldn't do any, so you couldn't send spies out because you couldn't get any spies in, and it was you couldn't have, even embassy people couldn't go around looking looking for sites. So you've got this huge country with a whole range of different things going on. For instance, you've got all these Air Force bases. Now, what was really significant were the Air Force bases which had the capability to bomb outside of Russia, Europe. But in terms of the American interests, did any of these have nuclear weapons, or were they preparing for nuclear weapons, and would they be able to reach the United States of America?
There was also tremendous interest in signals intelligence, wasn't there? So there was a different type of flight would go on to try and gather signals intelligence.
The signals intelligence was designed to make the Americans understand how the Soviets responded to attack. It could tell them a number of things, including what units were where. So, if you've got a military unit and it's using radio or it's got radar, it's letting you know sort of where it is, how big it is, how many people involved. So there was a great emphasis with the Americans on gaining that kind of intelligence so that they could locate where the defences were, where the Air Force bases were that would perhaps have the right kind of units in. So there were a lot of different pieces of information that the Americans, as the British, were looking to try and establish.
And how did they avoid these aircraft being intercepted?
Most of the Western spy flight aircraft, the US or British ones, were only going to the border. So what they would do is they would head off towards the borders of the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc, looking very purposeful, heading towards some major target. So you might have an aircraft that appeared to be, if continuing on its flight course, heading towards Moscow. And the idea was, or it might be heading towards a naval base like Murmansk. And of course, the Soviets are thinking, well, is this going to come in, or what's it going to do? So they had to watch it. So they would throw up their radar, they put their radar on. And what, of course, these spy flights were doing they were recording the radar and the radio with a view to analysing them when they got back. It was quite hair-raising because mostly they only went up to the border, then turned round. But some would deliberately go across, and some would stray across. And the Russians didn't take kindly to this, and along the way, quite a few people, quite a lot of the crews were attacked, and various other problems occurred. It was a very risky business.
And so how many of those spy planes were shot down during the Cold War, and in what type of circumstances?
Well, during the whole of the Cold War, and across all the zones, so we're including China, Eastern Europe, as well as the Soviet Union, there are about 40 or so American aircraft were shot down in varying circumstances, and that includes one or two flights relating to the Korean War, and about 15 other flights, including British and also including Taiwanese U-2s, for instance.
And what were the relatives of the airmen who went missing after these aircraft were shot down told that had happened to them?
The relatives were often told virtually nothing. They were told that they were on flights, that were routine flights, that's all. And something had
for
gone
training
wrong.
purposes.
But yeah, routine flights for training purposes, and very little information was imparted. In some cases, it wasn't until I made the film that some of the relatives began to understand what was really going on. Some had suspicions, but it was a very different world, and in many cases the crews didn't tell their relatives what they were doing at all.
And why did President Truman order a halt to the spy flights, and how did he get round this ban?
Well, there's a very interesting question there as to whether President Truman knew what was going on during his period as president, because he banned spy flights. one of the things you've really got to grasp about this is spy flights were perceived to be hugely provocative. It wasn't sort of, oh, we can do this when we feel like it. It was well known that this was a major. I mean, it's a real sort of, if you think about it, it's a real thumbs up to thumb in your nose to the opposition. That if you can go over their borders with impunity, it's pretty insulting and it's very provocative. And that was sort of part of the agreement. And certainly, some American generals enjoyed that wanted to do it because it was provocative more than they were interested in the reconnaissance in a way. So Truman banned it, but then the US were desperate for the kind of intelligence that, if they had this huge bomber fleet which they wanted to send in case of war to the Soviet Union, well, where were they due to put their bombs? Well, they didn't exactly know. So they needed these reconnaissance flights to go in and tell them, where to target their bombing. I mean, you've got a nuclear bomb. You don't want to put it in the middle of a cornfield, even if a very large cornfield. You want to put it either on an industrial site, a military site, or, as some of the more aggressive American generals wanted to put it on urban centres to wipe out populations.
And how did the RAF reconnaissance missions operate, and what did they fly over?
Well, if you look at where the British were at the end of the Second World War, the RAF was very much dismantled largely. It was a real, very, very small by, say, 1947, 48. But, and the Americans were absolutely thriving, and the British wanted to play. So they were very anxious to, engage with the Americans and show that the British military was still in the game and that they could still do things. Their big problem, of course, was that they didn't have much in the way of aircraft. Their aircraft, they were sort of still using up, if you like, the aircraft that they had from World War II. We didn't really have the resources to play the jet game, although we tried, but we had real trouble making aircraft that were equivalent to the Americans. So British were game to do some spy flights that the Americans couldn't do because of President Truman's ban. So the problem was, what aircraft? So the resolution was found to use RAF crews flying under RAF colours, but using what were really specialist American reconnaissance aircraft, the like of which we didn't have, and these aircraft had the capability to do the job.
So effectively, British people flew American aircraft rebadged.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and what routes were these British spy flights?
Well, we don't know the exact routes, except that there were 3 routes penetrating broadly into the Soviet Union in this period. There was a flight to the south of Moscow, we know that. That was the longest flight. There was one in the middle, if you like, and one up towards Murmansk that went, and all of them went quite deep into the Soviet Union. And they did this on the occasions when these flights took place. That was the pattern. 3 aircraft doing these 3 broad thrusts, and also it was to pick up a patchwork of targets. So these weren't straight lines. These were, it would be go to airfield here, go to testing site here, go to barracks complex here, and then go past this industrial area here. So they it would be flying in a slight zigzag or
a sort of evasive pattern.
Yeah, and then they turned back around and came back, and perhaps they were taking pictures on the way back too.
And what was the Soviet reaction to these overflights?
Of course, the pilots had no idea what the reaction was. They didn't even know if they'd been spotted in one of the flights. But in fact, as a result of the film, we tracked down Soviet defense officials and military officers who said, yes, we did know, and boy, did it cause a problem, because this was really insulting to the Soviet military that these flights came in. They were very provocative, and we tried to do something about them, but really we couldn't get at them, and
the difficulty was that the Soviet MiG jets couldn't get high enough to intercept the flights.
Yeah, and in fact, talking to 2 pilots, they would. I remember talking to an RAF, a particular RAF pilot who flew at U-2 over the Soviet Union, and he talked about looking at underneath the pilot was like a glass window, so you could look down, and he could see these vapor trails coming up, trying to get up to where he was. But he was at 70,000 feet, and at that point, the MiGs couldn't get up that far. So he would see them trying to get up, and straining, and then going back down. And it was sufficiently far that he didn't get particularly upset by it. But I mean, I personally would have found it quite alarming if I'd been in his position.
Absolutely. And there was also anti-aircraft fire, wasn't there, as well?
Well, going back to the RB-45C flights,
Those are the RAF flights.
These are the RAF flights used in this kind of aircraft known as a Tornado, but its designation was RB-45C, was that these aircraft went in, and the Russians sent up MiGs, but they got nowhere near them. But what then happens, and the chap who told me a lot of this story in the most detail was Flight Lieutenant Rex Sanders, and he described, he was the navigator of the leader, the unit commander's aircraft. And on the way back, he described that he'd flown over Germany and done a lot of most of them had done bombing raids over Germany, a lot of them during the war. And he said that what they encountered rather surprised them, because they were somewhere where they wouldn't have expected, but they ran into a barrage of what he calls predictive flak. Well, predictive flak is where the radar picks you up and then tells the guns where to aim. But unfortunately for the Soviets, that their predictions were wrong. So they were running along on a flight, and in front of them was this barrage, but it was moving at the same rate as them, but in front of them, so it never hit them. And of course, Rex Sanders was a classic stiff upper there, RAF chap, and he said he was rather upset because it upset, the navigation he was doing this radar reconnaissance, and all this firing and the sort of it made it hard for him to do his job properly, and he was quite put out by it.